So the SharePoint Client Object Model is it's a set of managed code and JavaScript libraries that support traditional .NET assemblies and executables. Really what the idea is to, instead of having to call the SharePoint Web Services directly, a client object model is created. Actually, several different libraries were created for different types of platforms so they could more easily interact with SharePoint, because more and more SharePoint is turning into more of a set of services that can be called externally, and that's kind of the strategy going forward with SharePoint. For a little background on SharePoint, the last few versions have gotten web services, and prior to SharePoint 2010, they were using the old ASMX version, ASP.NET Web Services with ASMX extension. And then in SharePoint 2010, they started using WCF, Windows Communication Foundation Web Services, and so a new endpoint was created, but it was still using SOAP. So now, the other part that wasn't really that great about the web service APIs for SharePoint is that they didn't really cover everything in the server object model. But now, pretty much everything is covered except for some of the things that you may need to do from an admin standpoint. So things that may touch like the web application level or the farm level. And part of that was Microsoft learning from hosting SharePoint that with SharePoint Online not allowing people to upload, touch the server basically. So they needed to find a way to let people interact with the data on the server without actually touching the server. So the answer was to enhance the web services APIs, and that's exactly what's happened in SharePoint 2013. So now, besides just making these services great, that's still a little bit complex because then you need to know exactly how to call the services. So what Microsoft did was they created, starting in 2010, the idea of the client-side object model, or CSOM, and support for traditional .NET assemblies and executables. And back then, it was support for Silverlight, and there was a JavaScript library. So those are all still there, but now there's some new support added. So now there's a managed library for Windows Phone. And so these managed libraries, what they do is they kind of abstract away any of the details of connecting to and communicating with the WCF service. And the JavaScript client-side object model has been updated as well with all of the new services that have been added. So it just makes a really nice alternative to web services. Another thing that was added in 2013 is the same endpoint that serves up XML through the client.service endpoint now also serves up REST with OData support. So the reason why that's really important is because with the client-side, with the client object model, those were only able to work on Windows machines. If you wanted to interact with SharePoint from a different type of platform, then you need to basically form those XML requests by hand and send them to the WCF service on SharePoint, and that wasn't very easy. But REST is a much simpler format. So REST is just an easier way of interacting with the services, just using the standard HTTP protocol. So using, if you want to get data, you use an HTTP GET request. Things like if you're wanting to delete something, you can use an HTTP delete request. So it supports the full create, read, update, and delete scenario. And OData support is nice because it allows us to declaratively do things like sorting and filtering and that type of thing without having to do anything in our code. We can just put that in our REST request, and the data will come back exactly how we specified. Now, the important thing about REST here is that since it's so easy to use, it's really easy to consume from other platforms. So if you're working on a PHP website and you need to talk to data in SharePoint, well, then in that case, you'd use a REST endpoint. But if you're working on, say you have a regular .NET and maybe like a Windows Forms application or Windows WPF, Windows Presentation Foundation application, then you would go ahead and just reference the client object model assemblies, and then you would be able to use client object model and not worry about those web service calls. So obviously the big improvement is the new REST-based web service calls that accept the GET, PUT, and POST requests. They implement OData, and then there's several new APIs added. So the existing ones were made more complete, and then several more were added on top of that. So this really gives us full coverage now of pretty much everything that can be done in the browser in SharePoint. You can interact with that data through the web services. And then the client-side object model for Windows Phone has been added, so it makes it very easy for people building apps for Windows Phone to interact with SharePoint data. So with the client object model, communicates with the client.svc, the client.service. It's a WCF service endpoint. And what that does is it provides the nice interfaces to the SharePoint server-side API. So if you look at the diagram, the client application would be using client object model, and then it would be making a call into the endpoint. The client object model would be making that call. As a developer, you don't need to worry about those details. You just use the client-side object model. You say the URL of the site that you want to communicate with, and then from there you go ahead and continue programming against the context that you've created for your site. And then when the request comes in to the WCF endpoint, client.svc, it's going to go ahead and do all the work using the SharePoint server-side API. One other thing to note is the client.svc WCF endpoint supports REST, and it also can return either XML, JSON data, or Atom feed data, which is really nice, especially with the JSON data, because then you can make calls with it. And the JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation, is much more compact than XML, so there's much less data going across the wire. So that way, in that regard, since we're making a lot more calls over the wire now, we need a way to do it faster, and JSON definitely helps make those calls a lot faster because there's a lot less payload going across the wire.